The time we had the very first, I remember, the very first EAP regional training of this nature was sometime back in 2014, 2015, around there. And at the time, the region was facing the height of a poaching crisis, which was so bad that 3 of the East Africa states, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, were included in the infamous Gang of 8 by CITES as among the countries which were most responsible globally for either source or transit or consumer states. And at that time, just to give you maybe a context in terms of numbers, Kenya lost a quarter of its rhinos, lost about 12 or so % of its elephants. Tanzania did even worse. They lost 60% of their elephants. And when I talk about 60% of elephants in Tanzania, you know, people think it's it's an abstract number. 60% of elephants in Tanzania are basically all the elephants in Uganda presently. So you can imagine Uganda without a single elephant. That is what was lost in Tanzania, because they had a lot of elephants at the time. We were facing a situation where every day there was almost a wildlife trafficking case. So much so, in Kenya we had to have a court set up at the airport just to try and fast track the hearing of some of these cases. And the same was true in the rest of the countries which are present here. Now, since then, the East Africa Association of Prosecutors, together with the national prosecuting authorities that they represent, started to have a very concerted focus on improving the standards of prosecution of wildlife crime. Remember, wildlife crime at the time was seen as a peripheral concern traditionally. Wildlife crime or environmental cases generally don't tend to end up at the top of the list of focus for national prosecuting authorities. In fact, in a country like Kenya or even Uganda, for example, the ODPP in these countries was not involved in prosecuting wildlife crime at all. These cases were being left to the wildlife authorities to not only investigate the cases, but to prosecute them, which was overwhelming them because they didn't have the necessary capacity. And wildlife crime was basically being treated as a petty crime in the region. Since then, things have changed. Wildlife crime now is being treated as a serious transnational organized crime. We have seen efforts led by prosecutors to amend the law, which is very unique. Often, you know, prosecutors are in the business of applying the law as it is. They leave the business of lawmaking to parliamentarians and politicians. Yeah. The impetus to change the law in Kenya, for example in Uganda, even in Tanzania, all these countries started reforming their wildlife offenses very rapidly. And the offenses were almost identical, even in terms of the scales of penalties being applied. We moved from, for example, in Kenya, from having the lowest, the highest penalty being 40,000 Kenya shillings, or the equivalent of $400 or so, to the minimum. We moved to a minimum sentencing regime. And the minimum sentence generally for a lot of these offenses is 1 million shillings, or about $10,000 US. That's quite a jump. For the first time, wildlife crimes of certain types actually now attract in the region life sentences. That tells you the seriousness with which now countries in this region take wildlife crime.
Tunaahidi mashtaka yenye haki na usawa.